Bullies steal new kids' lunch money. Huge error. He was a ninja in disguise. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Roosevelt High School as Kieran Thorne kept his head down, navigating the crowded hallways like a ghost among the living. His dark hair, longer than the current fashion dictated, fell across his angular face like a protective curtain between him and the world that seemed determined to notice him for all the wrong reasons. 3 weeks had passed since his transfer from the misty mountains of Oregon, and in that short time he had already established himself as the perfect target for those who fed on the suffering of others. Quiet as a whisper, slight of build despite his height, and friendless in the way that only comes from being the perpetual outsider. His oversized charcoal hoodie, a deliberate choice to obscure his lean but muscled frame, hung loose around his shoulders like armor made of cotton and anonymity. The fabric was soft from countless washings, a hand-me-down from his older cousin that carried the faint scent of cedar from the Oregon forests he missed with an ache that settled deep in his chest. His worn sneakers, once white but now a weathered gray, made no sound against the polished linoleum floors as he moved with an unconscious grace that spoke of years of training in the silent arts. What his classmates didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend as they hurried past him in their designer clothes and cloud of expensive cologne, was that Kieran had spent the last 8 years of his young life training in the ancient discipline of traditional ninjutsu under the patient, weathered hands of his grandfather. Takeshi Thorne, a former Special Forces operative who had learned the deadly arts during his military service in post-war Japan, had been more than a grandfather to Kieran. He had been mentor, teacher, and the closest thing to a father figure the boy had ever known. The old man's lessons echoed through Kieran's mind like a mantra as he walked, the discipline that turned chaos into order, the stealth that made him invisible when he chose to be, the deadly precision that could end a fight before it truly began. All of these skills lived beneath Kieran's unassuming exterior like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release its stored energy, like a sword wrapped in silk, beautiful and harmless until the moment it was drawn. But that moment hadn't come yet, and Kieran prayed it never would. His grandfather's most important teachings echoed in his mind with the weight of absolute truth. A true warrior fights only when all other options are exhausted, Kieran-kun. Violence should be the last resort, not the first response. The strongest man is not the one who can destroy his enemies, but the one who can choose not to. So Kieran endured with stoic silence, the shoulder checks in the hallway that sent him stumbling into lockers, the whispered insults that followed him like shadows from class to class, and the cruel laughter that seemed to echo off the walls whenever he appeared. The trouble had started on his very first day at Roosevelt High, a modern brick and glass monument to suburban education that sprawled across several acres like a small city unto itself. The building hummed with the energy of nearly 2,000 students, their voices creating a constant background noise that reminded Kieran of the wind through the Douglas firs back home. But unlike the peaceful forests of his childhood, this place carried an undercurrent of tension, of predator and prey dynamics that had been refined over generations of teenage hierarchy. It was during lunch on that first day, as Kieran sat alone at a corner table in the massive cafeteria, that Bryce Kellerman had first noticed him. Bryce was a towering figure even among his fellow seniors, standing 6'3" with the kind of natural athleticism that had made him a star linebacker since his freshman year. His sun-bleached hair was perfectly styled in the casual way that only came from expensive salon visits, and his perpetual sneer seemed to be a permanent fixture on his chiseled features, as if his face had forgotten how to arrange itself into any other expression. Bryce ruled Roosevelt High School with an iron fist wrapped in a Letterman jacket, his authority as unquestioned as gravity itself. Students stepped aside when he walked down the hallway. Teachers looked the other way when his voice rose in anger, and even the administration seemed reluctant to challenge someone whose father donated generously to the athletic department. He was flanked always by his loyal lieutenants, Mason Torres, a compact wrestler whose angry dark eyes seemed to search constantly for signs of weakness in others, and Derek Hawthorne, whose family's considerable wealth had bought him everything except personality, leaving him a hollow echo of privilege and entitlement. "Look what we have here," Bryce had announced during that first fateful lunch, his voice carrying across the cafeteria like a challenge thrown down before medieval knights. The conversations around him had gradually quieted as students sensed the familiar prelude to entertainment: fresh meat. His words had hung in the air like smoke, and every eye in the immediate vicinity had turned toward the corner table where Kieran sat with his simple brown bag lunch, looking for all the world like he wished he could disappear entirely. The new kid's sandwich, peanut butter and jelly on wheat bread that he had made himself that morning, suddenly felt like sawdust in his mouth as he realized he had become the center of unwanted attention. Kieran had simply gathered his things with deliberate calm, his movements economical and precise in the way his grandfather had taught him. He rose from his seat with fluid grace and moved to another table across the cafeteria, ignoring the eruption of laughter that followed in his wake like the roar of a crowd at a gladiatorial arena. He told himself it was strategy, not cowardice, though the distinction felt meaningless when shame burned in his chest like acid. "Pick your battles," his grandfather always said. This wasn't his battle yet. But Bryce Kellerman was not the type to let perceived slights go unanswered, and what he saw as disrespect would not be forgotten or forgiven. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks was as predictable as it was relentless. Bryce and his crew would corner Kieran in the bathroom between classes, surrounding him like wolves circling wounded prey, demanding his lunch money with mock politeness that made their threats all the more sinister. "Nothing personal, Thorne," Bryce would say with that trademark sneer, his voice dripping with false courtesy, while his eyes remained as cold as winter stones. "But new kids need to learn how things work around here. Think of it as tuition for your education in Roosevelt High social dynamics." Mason would crack his knuckles meaningfully while Derek counted the crumpled bills with exaggerated care. Their routine polished from years of practice. The amounts were never large, $5 here, $10 there, but it wasn't really about the money. It was about establishing dominance, about making sure Kieran knew his place in the carefully constructed hierarchy that governed teenage life. They would trip him in the hallway during passing periods, their timing perfect to send his books scattering across the floor like fallen leaves, while other students stepped over the mess without a second glance, their eyes carefully averted to avoid becoming involved. In the cafeteria, they would bump into him just as he lifted his lunch tray, their movements appearing accidental to any casual observer, sending food cascading down his already shabby clothes like some cruel parody of a food fight. The humiliation was as carefully orchestrated as a symphony. They would mock his thrift store clothes, pointing out the small tears and faded patches with theatrical disgust. They would imitate his quiet voice in exaggerated whispers, turning his very existence into a source of entertainment for their growing audience of followers who laughed along to avoid becoming targets themselves. Derek, with his family's money and connections, would make comments about Kieran's obviously inferior breeding, while Mason would demonstrate wrestling moves using Kieran as an unwilling practice dummy whenever teachers weren't looking. The worst part, Kieran realized with growing bitterness, wasn't the bullying itself, it was the silence of everyone else. Teachers looked the other way when Bryce's voice rose in the hallway, suddenly finding pressing paperwork that required their immediate attention. Students pretended not to see when Kieran was shoved into lockers or when his homework was accidentally destroyed, their eyes sliding past him as if he were invisible. Even the so-called good kids, The ones with kind hearts who probably felt sorry for him kept their distance to avoid becoming targets themselves. The mathematics of survival in high school were simple and brutal. Better him than me. The isolation was suffocating. Kieran would sit alone at lunch, watching other students laugh and joke with their friends while he mechanically chewed his sandwich and tried to ignore the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. He would walk through the hallways like a ghost, present but not really there, existing in the spaces between other people's lives. At night, he would lie in his bed in the small apartment he shared with his parents, his father working double shifts at the local factory, his mother cleaning office buildings downtown, and stare at the ceiling while his grandfather's teachings warred with his growing anger. Everything changed the day Kieran first noticed Emma Chen in his advanced chemistry class. She was beautiful in an understated way that had nothing to do with the artificial perfection so prized by the popular crowd. Her straight black hair fell to her shoulders in a simple cut that framed her delicate features, and her intelligent dark eyes seemed to see the world with a clarity that was both gentle and penetrating. Unlike most students at Roosevelt High, Emma seemed to exist outside the rigid social hierarchy that governed teenage life, moving through the halls with quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and being comfortable with that knowledge. Emma was kind to the outcasts without making a show of it, patient with struggling classmates without condescension, and completely unimpressed by Bryce Kellerman's attempts to charm her with his usual combination of athletic prowess and barely contained arrogance. Kieran had watched from across the cafeteria as Bryce approached her table with his most winning smile, only to see Emma politely but firmly decline his invitation to sit with the popular crowd. The rejection had been delivered with such grace that even Bryce couldn't claim offense, though the muscle in his jaw had twitched with barely controlled irritation. Kieran found himself looking forward to chemistry class with an anticipation that had nothing to do with molecular structures or chemical equations. The class met in a modern laboratory on the second floor, with tall windows that overlooked the school's courtyard and state-of-the-art equipment that still smelled faintly of the cleaning solutions used to maintain it. Mrs. Patterson, their teacher, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who believed that science was best learned through hands-on experimentation, which meant that students were often paired together for various projects and assignments. It was during one such assignment, balancing complex chemical equations, that Kieran first found the courage to speak directly to Emma. She had been struggling with a particularly challenging problem, her brow furrowed in concentration as she erased and rewrote the same equation for the third time. "You might try starting with the most complex molecule first," Kieran suggested quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he leaned slightly toward her desk. "Sometimes working backwards makes it easier to see the patterns." Emma looked up at him with surprise, not because his suggestion was unwelcome, but because it was the first time she had heard him speak voluntarily in class. "Really? I've been trying to balance from left to right, like Mrs. Patterson showed us." "That works for simple equations," Kieran explained, warming slightly to the subject. "But for complex ones, it's like untying a knot. Sometimes you have to find the right thread to pull first." Emma tried his approach, and to her delight, the equations suddenly made sense. The numbers fell into place with an elegance that made her smile, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her entire face and made Kieran's heart skip in his chest. "You're really good at this," she said, turning to face him fully for the first time. "Have you always been into science?" "I like puzzles," Kieran replied, his voice still quiet but steadier now. "Chemistry is just puzzles with atoms instead of pieces. Once you understand the rules, everything else follows logical patterns." Emma's smile widened, And for a moment, Kieran forgot about everything else. The bruises on his ribs from yesterday's encounter with Mason Torres, the torn homework that Derek had accidentally spilled coffee on that morning, the constant weight of being nobody in a school full of somebodies. In Emma's presence, he felt like he might actually be someone worth knowing. "I never thought about it that way," Emma mused, looking at her now balanced equation with new appreciation. "You make it sound almost artistic." "My grandfather used to say that everything in the universe follows patterns," Kieran found himself saying, surprised by his own willingness to share something so personal. "Science, martial arts, even human behavior. Once you learn to see the patterns, you can predict what comes next." "Your grandfather sounds wise," Emma said softly, noting the past tense and the brief shadow that crossed Kieran's features. "What kind of martial arts?" Kieran hesitated, suddenly aware that they were venturing into territory he had kept carefully hidden from everyone at Roosevelt High. "Traditional Japanese styles, mostly. He served in Japan after the war and learned from some very old masters. He said the physical techniques were just the beginning. The real art was in understanding when not to use them." Emma studied his face with those intelligent eyes, seeing something in his quiet demeanor that others missed. "That sounds like wisdom too. I think I'd like to meet him sometime." The shadow deepened across Kieran's features, and Emma immediately sensed she had touched on something painful. "He passed away last summer," Kieran said quietly. That's why we moved here. My parents thought a change of scenery would help." "I'm sorry," Emma said, and her sympathy was so genuine that Kieran felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "It sounds like he meant a lot to you." "Everything," Kieran whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. From that day forward, Emma made an effort to include Kieran in class discussions and group projects. She would save him a seat during lab periods, share her notes when he missed something due to one of Bryce's interventions, and gradually drew him into conversations about everything from molecular theory to philosophy. Emma discovered that beneath Kieran's quiet exterior lay a sharp intelligence and a depth of knowledge that surprised her. He had read widely, philosophy, history, literature, and could discuss complex ideas with a maturity that belied his 17 years. "You're not like other people our age," Emma observed one afternoon as they carefully measured compounds for their latest experiment. The chemistry lab was nearly empty, most students having rushed off to more immediately gratifying pursuits, but Emma and Kieran had developed a habit of staying late to perfect their work. "You think about things differently." Kieran's hands stilled over the beaker he was holding, precise measurements forgotten for a moment. "My grandfather raised me to think for myself. He said that most people go through life reacting to things instead of understanding them. He taught me to observe, to analyze, to look for the deeper patterns beneath surface events." "Is that why you don't fight back?" Emma asked gently, the question hanging in the air between them like a delicate chemical balance that could tip either way. "Against Bryce and his friends, I mean. I've seen what they do to you." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, carefully measuring sodium hydroxide with the same precision his grandfather had taught him to apply to everything in life. "Violence is the last resort of the incompetent," he said finally, quoting something he had heard years ago. "My grandfather taught me that true strength comes from having the power to destroy your enemies and choosing not to use it." "But how long can you keep choosing restraint?" Emma pressed, genuine concern coloring her voice. "They're getting worse. Derek actually pushed you down the stairs yesterday, and I saw the way you winced when you sat down today." The truth was that Kieran's body was a map of Bryce's escalating cruelty. Bruises on his ribs from being slammed into lockers, a cut on his lip from accidentally walking into Derek's elbow, the constant low-grade pain that came from being used as target practice by teenagers who had learned that power could be taken by force. But admitting this to Emma felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that his grandfather's teachings weren't enough to protect him in this concrete and steel environment, so different from the misty forests of Oregon. "I can endure it," Kieran said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "It's just high school. It won't last forever." Emma reached out and touched his hand gently, her skin warm against his cold fingers. "You shouldn't have to endure it, Kieran. No one should." The simple human contact sent electricity shooting up Kieran's arm, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have someone truly care about his welfare. But the moment was shattered by the sound of raucous laughter from the hallway, and both teenagers quickly returned to their work as other students began filtering back into the lab. But Bryce Kellerman noticed everything that happened in his domain, including the way the new kid's face lit up whenever he talked to Emma Chen. Bryce had been watching the gradual development of their friendship with growing irritation, his possessive nature unable to tolerate the idea that the prettiest, smartest girl in their class was wasting her time on someone so far beneath her social station. Emma had repeatedly turned down his invitations to various parties and football games, but Bryce had attributed this to natural feminine coyness rather than genuine disinterest. The thought that she might actually prefer the company of a nobody like Kieran Thorne was both incomprehensible and infuriating. As October progressed and the leaves outside Roosevelt High turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Bryce's treatment of Kieran grew increasingly personal and vicious. What had begun as standard bullying evolved into something approaching genuine hatred, fueled by jealousy and wounded pride. Mason and Derek, ever eager to please their leader, escalated their own behavior accordingly. They would corner Kieran in empty classrooms, in unused stairwells, in the forgotten corners of the school where teachers rarely ventured. "You think you're special, don't you?" Derek would sneer, his voice carrying the particular venom that only the privileged could muster when confronted with someone who refused to acknowledge their superiority. "You think just because Emma Chen feels sorry for you, that makes you somebody." Mason preferred physical intimidation, using his wrestling training to put Kieran in painful holds that left no visible marks, but made it clear that worse was possible. "You're nothing," he would whisper in Kieran's ear as he applied pressure to nerve points with the skill of someone who had learned to cause pain without leaving evidence. "Less than nothing, and everybody knows it, except you." But it was Bryce himself who delivered the psychological torture with surgical precision. He had a gift for finding exactly the right words to cut deepest, for identifying the insecurities that lay beneath Kieran's stoic exterior and exposing them to the harsh light of public humiliation. He would wait until Emma was within earshot before making his most cutting remarks, ensuring that she witnessed Kieran's powerlessness in vivid detail. "Hey, Thorne," Bryce called out one afternoon as Kieran passed through the main hallway during lunch period. Emma was at her locker nearby, organizing her books for afternoon classes, and Bryce's timing was perfectly calculated to ensure she heard every word. "I've been thinking about your situation here at Roosevelt High, and I've got some advice for you." Kieran kept walking, his grandfather's teachings about avoiding unnecessary confrontation echoing in his mind, but Bryce's voice followed him like a pursuing predator. "You see, some people are just born to be leaders," Bryce continued, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded hallway. "And some people are born to serve. The sooner you accept which category you fall into, the easier your life will be." Students had begun to gather, sensing the familiar prelude to entertainment. Emma's hands stilled on her textbooks, her knuckles white as she gripped the spine of her calculus book. "Now, I've been watching you make puppy dog eyes at Emma over there, Bryce continued, his voice taking on a tone of false concern. And I think it's only fair to let you know that girls like Emma don't date down, if you know what I mean. She's going to end up with someone who matters, someone who can provide for her, someone who... That's enough, Emma's voice cut through Bryce's monologue like a blade. She had turned from her locker to face him, her dark eyes blazing with anger that transformed her gentle features into something fierce and uncompromising. Leave him alone, Bryce. Bryce's sneer widened, delighted to have provoked exactly the reaction he had been hoping for. Oh, I see. The lady has strong feelings about this. How sweet. But Emma, you can't save every stray dog that wanders onto campus. Some things are just natural selection at work. The gathered crowd had grown larger, phones appearing as students sensed that something significant was about to happen. Emma took a step toward Bryce, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing presence, but her courage unwavering. "Kieran is worth 10 of you," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hallway. "He's intelligent, kind, and genuinely cares about other people. You're just a bully who's afraid that people will see through your act if you stop making others feel small." The silence that followed Emma's declaration was complete and absolute. No one had ever spoken to Bryce Kellerman that way, certainly not in front of an audience. The unthinkable had happened. Someone had challenged the king in his own court. Bryce's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage, his carefully constructed image of invincibility cracking before the eyes of his subjects. "You know what, Emma?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I think you need some time to reconsider your social choices, and I think your boyfriend here needs to learn some respect." Kieran, who had stopped walking during Emma's defense of him, turned slowly to face Bryce. For the first time in weeks, his dark eyes met Bryce's directly, and something passed between them. A recognition of impending conflict that both had been building toward since that first day in the cafeteria. "Leave her out of this," Kieran said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent hallway. "Your problem is with me." "Oh, I don't have a problem," Bryce laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I'm just trying to help everyone understand how things work around here. Emma, Mason, Derek, why don't you help our friend here understand his place in the Roosevelt High ecosystem?" The confrontation finally came to a head on a Friday afternoon in late October, when the autumn air had turned crisp and the sky was the color of old pewter. Kieran was walking toward the student parking lot, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder, when he heard Emma's voice from behind the gymnasium. But it wasn't her usual confident tone. There was fear in it, real fear that made Kieran's blood turn to ice in his veins. "I already told you no, Bryce. Please just leave me alone." The words carried clearly in the cool air, and Kieran felt every muscle in his body tense with an alertness that his grandfather had drilled into him over years of training. The tone, the words, the underlying current of threat, all of it triggered responses that had been conditioned into him at a cellular level. "Come on, Emma," came Bryce's voice, carrying that familiar note of false reasonableness that made his threats all the more sinister. "One date. That's all I'm asking for. I'm not some kind of monster here. I'm the starting linebacker. My father owns half this town, and I can show you things that your little boyfriend never could. What's the problem?" Kieran dropped his backpack without conscious thought, his body moving with the fluid precision of someone who had been trained to respond to danger without hesitation. He pressed himself against the brick wall of the gymnasium and moved silently toward the sound of voices. Every lesson his grandfather had taught him about stealth and observation flooding back with crystalline clarity. The autumn leaves crunched softly under other students' feet, but Kieran's passage was as silent as smoke, as invisible as shadow. He pressed himself against the corner of the building and carefully peered around the edge, his trained eyes taking in the scene with tactical precision. Emma was backed against the brick wall of the gymnasium, her chemistry textbooks clutched against her chest like a shield, her dark eyes wide with fear, but still defiant. Bryce loomed over her, one muscular arm braced against the wall beside her head in a classic intimidation pose that effectively trapped her. Mason and Derek flanked him like loyal attack dogs, blocking any escape route and ensuring that their confrontation remained private. "What's the problem?" Bryce continued, his voice taking on a nastier edge as Emma's continued resistance began to anger him. "You'd rather hang out with losers like that freak Thorne? You think he can protect you? You think he can give you what you need?" "This isn't about anyone else," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that was making her heart race. "I just don't want to go out with you. I don't have to give you a reason beyond that." Bryce's laugh was cold and ugly, a sound that held no trace of genuine humor. "Actually, you do need to give me a reason, Emma. See, I don't like being embarrassed in front of the whole school. I don't like having my perfectly reasonable requests turned down by someone who should be grateful for the attention. Maybe you need some time to think about it. Mason, Derek, why don't you help Emma understand how things work around here?" The implicit threat in those words was unmistakable, and Emma's defiance finally gave way to genuine fear. She pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she could somehow disappear into the brick itself, her textbooks the only barrier between herself and whatever Bryce had in mind. Kieran's training took over before his conscious mind could process what was happening. 8 years of discipline, of precise movement, of reading an opponent's intentions before they themselves knew what they were going to do. All of it flowed through him like water finding its natural course. His grandfather had drilled into him the sacred importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, even if it meant breaking his own code of non-violence. "Hey!" Kieran's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade drawn from its sheath. The single word carried more authority and presence than anyone at Roosevelt High had ever heard from him, and all 4 heads turned toward him with surprise that bordered on shock. Emma's eyes widened with relief and something that might have been hope, while Bryce's face twisted into an expression of delighted anticipation. This was exactly what he had been waiting for, the opportunity to destroy Kieran Thorne completely and publicly, in front of the girl he was trying so desperately to impress. "Well, well, well," Bryce said, straightening up and turning to face Kieran fully. His trademark sneer spread across his chiseled features like oil on water. "Look who decided to play hero. You picked the wrong day to grow a backbone, Thorne." Kieran stepped out from behind the corner of the gymnasium, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he wasn't trying to make himself invisible. His posture was different, straighter, more balanced, with the kind of centered stillness that spoke of absolute readiness. His dark eyes, usually hidden behind the fall of his hair, were clearly visible and fixed on Bryce with unwavering intensity. "Let her go," Kieran said, his voice calm and level, carrying none of the fear or uncertainty that had characterized his previous interactions with his tormentors. There was something in his tone that made even Mason and Derek shift uncomfortably, though they couldn't have said exactly what had changed. "Or what?" Derek laughed, but the sound was forced and nervous. He took a step toward Kieran, his expensive sneakers crunching on the fallen leaves. "You'll cry at us? Maybe run to tell your mommy?" Kieran's eyes never left Bryce's face, reading the older boy's body language with the same precision his grandfather had taught him to apply to chemical equations. Stance slightly forward, weight on the balls of his feet, shoulders tense with aggression, all signs of someone preparing for violence but lacking any real understanding of what violence meant. "I'm only going to ask once more," Kieran said, his voice carrying an odd formality that seemed out of place in a high school confrontation. "Let her go." "You know what?" Bryce said, his patience finally exhausted by what he saw as unacceptable defiance from his social inferior. "I'm getting tired of your attitude, Thorne. You've been walking around my school for weeks like you're something special, like the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to you. I think it's time someone taught you some manners." He nodded to Mason and Derek with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. "Why don't you teach our friend here about respect?" Mason moved first, his wrestler's instincts telling him to close distance quickly and take his opponent to the ground, where his superior weight and experience would matter most. He rushed forward with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight in his life, his muscular frame moving with the kind of practiced aggression that had dominated opponents on wrestling mats throughout the district. But Kieran wasn't there when Mason's arms reached the space he had occupied. He had shifted to the side with fluid grace, his movement so economical and precise that it seemed almost like a magic trick. Mason stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the absence of expected resistance, his momentum carrying him several steps past his intended target. Derek came from the right, swinging wild haymakers that looked impressive to untrained eyes, but telegraphed their intentions from miles away. Each punch was powered by anger and privilege rather than skill, thrown with the kind of undisciplined fury that characterized someone who had never faced real opposition. Kieran ducked under the first punch with minimal movement, his body bending just enough to let the fist whistle over his head, then stepped inside Derek's guard while the privileged boy was still committed to his wild swing. The palm strike that Kieran drove up into Derek's solar plexus was delivered with surgical precision, targeting the exact spot where his grandfather had taught him the body's breathing mechanism could be disrupted without causing permanent damage. Derek doubled over, gasping for air that suddenly refused to come, his face turning an alarming shade of red as his diaphragm spasmed. Mason had recovered from his initial stumble and charged again, this time more cautiously, but still with the kind of linear thinking that characterized someone whose only training came from organized sports. He was a wrestler, used to grappling and close combat, accustomed to using his strength and technical training to dominate opponents on a mat with clearly defined rules and a referee to ensure safety. But Kieran's training had prepared him for every type of fighter, every possible approach an attacker might take. When Mason reached for him, trying to secure a takedown that would let him use his wrestling skills, Kieran caught his wrist with precise timing and pivoted on his heel in a movement that flowed like water. The Seoi Nage throw was executed with textbook perfection, using Mason's own momentum and aggression against him, redirecting his force in a way that sent the muscular boy flying over Kieran's shoulder in a perfect arc. Mason hit the asphalt hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending shockwaves through his body. He lay there for several seconds, staring up at the grey October sky and trying to understand how someone half his size had just thrown him around like a child's toy. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, and suddenly it was just Kieran and Bryce facing each other across the small courtyard behind the gymnasium, while Emma watched in stunned silence from against the wall. The autumn air was filled with the sound of Derek's labored breathing and the distant noise of normal high school life continuing obliviously on the other side of the building. "Impossible," Bryce muttered, staring at his friends sprawled on the ground like broken toys. His mind struggled to process what he had just witnessed, the casual efficiency with which the quiet kid had dismantled two trained athletes. Then his expression hardened with rage that bordered on the pathological. "You got lucky, freak. Let's see how you do against someone who actually knows what he's doing." Bryce was bigger and stronger than his friends, with the kind of natural athleticism that had made him a star on the football field since his freshman year. His body was a weapon, forged by years of weight training and conditioning, sculpted by genetic gifts and relentless dedication to physical excellence. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never met an opponent he couldn't overpower through sheer physical dominance. But strength without technique was just brute force, and Kieran had been taught by a master who understood that the greatest victory came from turning an opponent's power against them. His grandfather's lessons echoed in his mind. The oak tree breaks in the storm, but the bamboo bends and survives. Be like bamboo, Kieran-kun. Bryce charged like a linebacker pursuing a quarterback, head down and arms extended, trying to tackle Kieran to the ground where his size advantage would allow him to pound his opponent into submission. It was a strategy that had worked countless times on the football field, where raw power and determination could overcome technique and finesse. But Kieran wasn't where Bryce expected him to be. He had moved to the side and slightly forward with the fluid precision of years of training, and as Bryce's momentum carried him past, Kieran grabbed his shoulder and helped him along, redirecting the bigger boy's own force against him in a perfect demonstration of the principle his grandfather had called yielding to overcome. Bryce crashed into the gymnasium wall with a resounding thud that echoed across the courtyard like a thunderclap. The impact was hard enough to rattle his teeth and send shockwaves through his skull, and he bounced off the brick like a ball thrown against a concrete floor. By now, other students had begun to gather, drawn by the sounds of conflict and the magnetic pull of witnessing something unprecedented. Word was spreading quickly through the school that someone was actually fighting back against Bryce Kellerman, and kids were running from all directions to witness what many had thought impossible. Holy crap, is that Kieran Thorne? Where did he learn to fight like that? Bryce is getting destroyed. Someone's recording this. This is going to be all over Instagram in like 5 minutes. Emma had moved away from the wall and was watching with wide eyes as Kieran continued to dismantle the school's most feared bully with surgical precision. Every one of Bryce's attacks was countered. Every attempt at intimidation was turned back on itself. Every display of brute force was redirected into empty air or solid brick. Bryce bounced off the wall and spun around, his face flushed with embarrassment and fury, a small trickle of blood running from where his lip had split against the rough brick. The taste of his own blood in his mouth was a new and unwelcome sensation for someone who had grown accustomed to being the one inflicting damage. "Stand still and fight me like a man," he roared, his voice carrying across the courtyard and drawing even more spectators. "I am fighting you," Kieran replied with maddening calm, settling back into the balanced stance his grandfather had drilled into him thousands of times in the misty Oregon mountains. "You're just not very good at it." The calculated insult had its intended effect. Bryce abandoned any pretense of strategy and came at Kieran with wild, telegraphed swings, putting all his strength behind every punch like a street brawler who had never faced real opposition. Each attack was powered by rage rather than skill, thrown with the kind of undisciplined fury that left him exposed and off balance. Kieran flowed around the attacks like water around stones, his movements economical and precise, occasionally striking nerve points and pressure points that his grandfather had shown him in the secret hours after formal training was complete. Each strike was calculated, a tap to the floating ribs that made Bryce gasp and stumble, a quick jab to a pressure point that numbed his left arm temporarily, a perfectly timed block that sent shockwaves of pain up Bryce's forearm and reminded him that bones could be fragile things when met with proper technique. The gathered crowd had grown to include nearly 50 students, their phones out and recording every second of Bryce Kellerman's systematic destruction. The footage would be uploaded to social media within minutes, shared and reshared until it reached every corner of Roosevelt High's social network and beyond. This is insane. Kieran's like some kind of ninja. How long has he been able to do this? Why didn't he fight back before? Bryce doesn't even know what hit him. Emma had never seen anything like it. The quiet, gentle boy she had come to know in chemistry class had transformed into something else entirely, not violent or cruel, but absolutely competent in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. Every movement was precise, every counter was perfectly timed, every defense flowed seamlessly into the next attack, like movements in a deadly dance. Finally, after what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, Bryce overextended himself on a particularly wild swing, his frustration finally overcoming what little tactical thinking he possessed. Kieran caught his arm with the same precision he applied to chemical equations, spun him around, and applied a submission hold that his grandfather had taught him years ago in a sun-dappled clearing behind their Oregon cabin. Bryce found himself face down on the asphalt, with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that promised serious injury if he tried to move. The position was uncomfortable, but not immediately damaging, a demonstration of control rather than cruelty. "Do you yield?" Kieran asked, his voice still perfectly calm, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system like liquid fire. "Get off me!" Bryce snarled, trying to struggle free and immediately regretting it as pain shot through his shoulder like lightning. The humiliation of being held down in front of half the school was almost worse than the physical discomfort. Kieran applied just enough pressure to make his point clear without causing permanent damage. "Do you yield?" The gathered crowd was silent, watching their former tormentor helpless on the ground like a defeated gladiator in an ancient arena. Some of them had phones out, recording every second of Bryce Kellerman's humiliation for posterity. For years, this moment had seemed impossible. Someone had actually beaten Bryce in a fair fight, and more than that, had done it with such casual competence that it made the bullies' previous dominance seem like nothing more than an elaborate illusion. "Yes," Bryce finally gasped, his voice breaking slightly on the word. "Yes, I yield. Let me go." Kieran held the position for another moment, making sure the lesson had sunk in, not just for Bryce, but for everyone watching, then released Bryce's arm and stepped back with the same fluid grace he had displayed throughout the fight. Bryce rolled over and sat up, cradling his shoulder and staring at Kieran with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and something that might have been respect. "How?" was all Bryce could manage, his voice small and confused in a way that none of his classmates had ever heard before. Kieran looked down at the boy who had made his life miserable for 3 weeks, and for a moment he could see past the arrogance and cruelty to the insecurity underneath. Bryce was just a kid who had learned that the only way to feel powerful was to make others feel powerless, who had built his entire identity around being stronger and more intimidating than everyone else. "My grandfather taught me that strength isn't about how much damage you can do," Kieran said, extending his hand to help Bryce to his feet. The gesture surprised everyone watching, including Bryce himself. "It's about knowing when not to use it." Bryce stared at the offered hand for a long moment, his mind struggling to process this final twist in a day that had already shattered everything he thought he knew about power and strength. Then, slowly and reluctantly, he accepted it. Kieran pulled him up with surprising gentleness, the same hands that had just systematically dismantled him now offering assistance and dignity. "I could have hurt you," Kieran continued, his voice low enough that only Bryce could hear over the excited chatter of the dispersing crowd. "I could have broken your arm, or your ribs, or worse. But that would have made me just like you used to be." The crowd began to disperse gradually, their phones full of video evidence that would be shared and reshared until it became legend. Mason and Derek had slunk away while everyone's attention was focused on the main event, too embarrassed and too sore to face the questions that would inevitably come. Emma approached cautiously, still trying to process what she had just witnessed. The gentle, quiet boy she knew from chemistry class was still there, but now she could see the steel underneath the silk, the carefully controlled power that he had kept hidden beneath his unassuming exterior. "Kieran?" she said softly, as if speaking to someone who might bolt at any sudden movement. "Are you okay?" He turned to face her, and she saw something in his dark eyes that hadn't been there before. Not arrogance or cruelty, but confidence. The quiet, overlooked boy was still there, but now there was visible strength underneath the gentleness, like bedrock beneath fertile soil. "I'm fine," he said, then looked at her with genuine concern that made her heart skip. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you? Did they—" "I'm okay," Emma assured him quickly, moved by the protective concern in his voice. "Thanks to you." She studied his face, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Where did you learn to do that? I mean, I know you said your grandfather taught you, but that was incredible." "Traditional ninjutsu," Kieran replied simply, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. "My grandfather learned it during his military service in post-war Japan. He said the physical techniques were just the beginning. The real art was in understanding when not to use them." "And you've been carrying that around with you all this time?" Emma asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Through everything Bryce and his friends did to you?" Kieran nodded, suddenly looking very young despite what she had just seen him do. "He taught me that violence should be the absolute last resort, that a true warrior fights only when all other options are exhausted and only to protect those who can't protect themselves." Bryce was still standing nearby, listening to their conversation with a strange expression on his face. For the first time in his life, someone had shown him mercy when they could have chosen revenge. It was a foreign concept to him, as alien as if Kieran had started speaking in an unknown language, but one that was slowly taking root in the fertile soil of his shattered worldview. "Thorn!" Bryce called out as Kieran and Emma started to walk away. They turned back, and Bryce struggled with words that didn't come easily to someone who had spent years using force rather than communication to get what he wanted. What I did to you, to Emma, to a lot of people, it wasn't right." Kieran nodded slowly, seeing the genuine struggle in Bryce's eyes. "No, it wasn't, but you can choose to be different now." "How do I do that?" Bryce asked, and for the first time, he sounded like the confused, insecure teenager he actually was, instead of the tyrant he had pretended to be for so long. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Start by apologizing to everyone you've hurt," Kieran suggested gently, "and then actually mean it. Figure out who you want to be when you're not trying to make other people afraid of you." The weeks that followed brought a quiet revolution to Roosevelt High School. Word of Kieran's victory had spread far beyond just the students who witnessed it. Teachers who had previously ignored the bullying suddenly found themselves paying closer attention to their classrooms and hallways, as if a spell had been broken that had made them blind to the suffering happening right in front of them. Students who had once crossed the street to avoid Bryce Kellerman began to realize that their tormentor was just as human and fallible as everyone else. The video footage of the fight, recorded on dozens of phones and edited into highlight reels that circulated endlessly through social media, became the stuff of legend. But more than just entertainment, it served as proof that the impossible was possible, that bullies could be stopped, that power structures that seemed permanent could be toppled by someone brave enough to stand up. Bryce himself seemed to struggle with his new reality, like a man learning to walk after years of paralysis. The easy intimidation that had once guaranteed his social dominance was gone, replaced by a grudging respect for the quiet kid who had shown him mercy when he deserved none. He made awkward but genuine apologies to several students he had terrorized over the years. Some accepted them, others didn't. But he continued trying with a persistence that surprised everyone who knew him. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate. Bryce would catch himself falling into old patterns, raising his voice to get his way or using his size to intimidate, only to remember that his reputation for invincibility had been thoroughly shattered. He found himself having to navigate social situations with words instead of threats, having to earn respect instead of demanding it through fear. Mason and Derek, robbed of their leader's protection and their own aura of invincibility, found themselves on the receiving end of the same treatment they had once dished out. But the cycle of bullying seemed to be losing its power at Roosevelt High, as more students followed Kieran's example of standing up for others without becoming aggressors themselves. The mathematics of high school survival were slowly changing from "better him than me" to "we don't have to accept this." Emma and Kieran's friendship deepened into something more meaningful with each passing day. They spent long afternoons in the chemistry lab, working on extra credit projects and talking about everything except the fight that had changed both their lives. The sterile environment of the lab, with its precise measurements and predictable reactions, became their sanctuary from the chaos of adolescent social dynamics. Emma learned about Kieran's grandfather in greater detail, how Takeshi Thorne had been a young soldier stationed in Japan during the American occupation, how he had been fascinated by the ancient martial traditions he encountered and had convinced an elderly master to teach him despite the cultural barriers. She discovered that Kieran's grandfather had passed away the previous summer after a brief illness, and that the boy's move to Roosevelt had been his parents' attempt to help him cope with grief that seemed to have no bottom. "I keep thinking about that day," Emma confessed one afternoon, as they carefully measured compounds for their latest experiment. The lab was quiet except for the gentle hum of ventilation systems and the distant sounds of after-school activities. "The way you moved, it was like watching someone become completely different in an instant." Kieran's hands stilled over the beaker he was holding, his precise movements faltering for just a moment. "I never wanted anyone to see that side of me. My grandfather always said that true strength should be invisible unless absolutely necessary." "But it was necessary," Emma said firmly, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had lived through genuine fear. "You saved me from something I couldn't save myself from, and you did it without becoming like them." "I used to think being strong meant never getting hurt," Emma confided during another of their late afternoon conversations. "But you got hurt for weeks before you fought back. That takes a different kind of strength." Kieran smiled, remembering his grandfather's weathered hands teaching him to find balance in all things. The old man's lessons seemed more relevant now than ever, his wisdom having guided Kieran through the most challenging period of his young life. He used to say that anyone can throw a punch, but it takes real strength to know when not to. The chemistry lab had become their refuge, a place where they could talk without the pressure of being observed by their classmates. Emma discovered that Kieran had depths she was only beginning to explore. He had read philosophy and literature far beyond what was required for their classes, could discuss complex ethical questions with the kind of thoughtfulness that came from real reflection rather than academic exercise. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked one day as they worked on balancing particularly complex equations. "Not fighting back sooner, I mean. All those weeks of letting them hurt you." Kieran considered the question carefully, as he did everything else. "I regret that it had to happen at all. I regret that Bryce and his friends learned to find power in making others feel powerless. But I don't regret trying every other option first. My grandfather taught me that violence changes everyone it touches, even when it's justified. I wanted to make sure there really was no other way. And now? Now I know that sometimes the only way to stop violence is with superior skill and restraint. But I'm grateful that I learned that lesson from someone who taught me both how to fight and why fighting should be avoided." The transformation at Roosevelt High wasn't complete or perfect. Institutional change never is, and high school social dynamics have a momentum that resists alteration. There were still students who preferred to look the other way rather than get involved, still teachers who found it easier to ignore problems than address them, still administrators who valued order over justice. But something fundamental had shifted in the school's ecosystem. The culture of fear that Bryce had cultivated was cracking like ice in spring, replaced by a growing understanding that strength came from protecting others, not dominating them. Students who had once been isolated found themselves with unexpected allies. Teachers began to notice patterns of behavior they had previously overlooked. The unspoken rules that had governed teenage hierarchy for generations were being quietly rewritten. Kieran found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously more visible and more left alone than he had ever been. His reputation as someone who could handle himself had spread throughout the school. But rather than making him a target for others seeking to prove themselves, it seemed to create a bubble of respect around him. Students nodded to him in the hallways, included him in group projects, invited him to sit with them at lunch. But Kieran remained fundamentally unchanged by his newfound status. He still preferred quiet conversations to loud parties, still found more meaning in balancing chemical equations than in the complex social chemistry of teenage popularity. The difference was that now his preferences were respected rather than mocked, his quiet nature seen as strength rather than weakness. As spring arrived and Kieran's first year at Roosevelt drew to a close, he found himself reflecting on the journey from invisible outcast to reluctant hero. The cherry trees that lined the school's front walkway burst into bloom, their pink petals falling like snow in the afternoon breeze and reminding him of the flowers his grandfather had tended in their Oregon garden. He had never wanted to fight, had tried everything possible to avoid conflict, but when protecting Emma became more important than protecting himself, the choice had been clear. His grandfather would have been proud, not of the fighting, but of the restraint, the mercy, and the wisdom to know that true victory lay not in defeating an enemy, but in helping them become something better. The last day of school found Kieran cleaning out his locker when Bryce approached, looking nervous and uncertain in a way that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The former bully had lost weight over the semester, trading his intimidating bulk for a leaner, more thoughtful appearance that somehow made him look younger and more approachable. "I wanted to thank you," Bryce said without preamble, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once characterized his every interaction. "For not destroying me when you could have." Kieran looked up from his locker, seeing the genuine gratitude in Bryce's eyes and the fundamental changes that months of introspection had wrought. "We all deserve a second chance." "I don't know if I would have given you one," Bryce admitted, with the kind of honest self-reflection that would have been impossible for his former self. "That's what makes you better than me." "Not better," Kieran corrected gently, closing his locker door and shouldering his backpack for the last time that year. "Just different, but you're different now too." They walked out of Roosevelt High School together, no longer enemies, but not yet friends. Two teenagers who had learned valuable lessons about strength, mercy, and the courage required to change. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the sound of other students celebrating the end of the school year filled the air with energy and possibility. "What are you doing this summer?" Bryce asked, as they reached the place where their paths would diverge. "Working with my father at the factory," Kieran replied. "Learning about honest work and helping my family." "What about you?" "Volunteer work," Bryce said, the word still sounding strange in his own mouth. "Community service, trying to figure out how to be useful instead of just taking up space." Kieran smiled, seeing in Bryce's uncertain expression the same kind of genuine desire for growth that he had felt after his grandfather's death. "That sounds like a good start." As they parted ways, each heading toward their own summer of growth and reflection, Kieran thought about the lessons his grandfather had tried to teach him. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show mercy. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is help someone else be brave. And sometimes the greatest victory is helping your opponent discover their own capacity for good. The quiet kid from Oregon had found his voice at Roosevelt High School, but more importantly, He had helped others find theirs too. And that, his grandfather would have said with pride, was the true art of the warrior, not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to build something better from the ashes of what came before. Emma appeared at his side as he reached his parents' car, having finished her own locker clean-out, and said goodbye to friends who would scatter across the country for summer adventures. She had become not just his closest friend, but his anchor to the world of normal teenage experience, the bridge between the warrior his grandfather had trained and the young man he was still becoming. "Ready for summer?" she asked, settling into the passenger seat as Kieran's mother waved to them from the driver's seat. "Ready for whatever comes next," Kieran replied, and meant it. The skills his grandfather had taught him would always be there, waiting beneath the surface like a blade wrapped in silk. But he had also learned something his grandfather might not have expected, that sometimes the greatest strength came not from ancient martial arts, but from the simple human connections that made life worth protecting in the first place.